Hi everyone, I'm Chris and this is my channel. I'll be talking a lot about politics, but from a very different perspective than you're probably used to. I might just be talking to the camera, but I might also read from books or articles and talk about them. I'll be talking about what I think is important, but I'll happily read all your suggestions too. My background is in so-called political science, and during and after my bachelor's, I thought I could think critically about politics. I was wrong. It took me years to unlearn the things I read at university. Unlearning it never really took place until I was prompted by other people, mostly, to question the assumptions inherent in political science and in the broader culture. You'll find that I like to go much deeper into a topic than most of the political, economic, etc. discourse out there. Today, I'm going to talk about why it's so hard to debate right-wingers. Not all of them, of course. The things I'm going to say might sound a bit like I'm stereotyping. I know there's lots of different people on the right. Their representatives, nearly all of the right-wing public speakers I've heard of, think and act in the ways I'm going to be describing. I'm certainly not trying to stereotype all conservatives. Some people who identify as conservative are thoughtful and brilliant. Look at Andrew Bacevich. Look at the magazine The American Conservative. They're worth listening to. Most right-wingers, however, are not. Let's talk about them. First of all, it's tough to agree on terms. And I've heard leftists actually take time out of debates with right-wingers to put them right on their definitions. Take socialism. Right-wingers are always talking about how evil socialism is. Well, anything can be evil if you have your own definitions. What does Wikipedia say? A good place to start, right? If we want to learn about something. Well, right in the first sentence of socialism, it says, social ownership of the means of production and workers' self-management. Okay, so we've got first social ownership of the means of production. That means that unlike under capitalism, everyone, or maybe just the people who work the machines or whatever the business is, owns the means of production. Under capitalism, they're privately owned by and for the benefit of a small group of people at the top who have more money and power than the people they manage. That's why a lot of leftists would say the USSR, for instance, is state capitalist, since the people who controlled the state controlled the means of production too. And there are different kinds of socialists, of course, so some people who identify as socialists or leftists would say the USSR model is ideal, and most of the rest of us think that's a terrible idea. For me, socialism would essentially, preferably, mean no ownership of the means of production, because society is everyone. And if everyone owns something, then no one does. No one would have the right to exclude others from the products of a factory, or for that matter, a farm, or a hospital, just because they don't have enough money. So the opposite of the way things are now. I'll go into more detail about how all this could work in later videos. The second thing from the definition was workers' self-management. In other words, no more hierarchy in the workplace, and ideally in society as a whole. You get rid of bosses, or at least make them work on the same level so they're not bosses anymore. And all workers as a whole make decisions together, or at least have to sign off on the important decisions together. That's why co-ops are sometimes held up as an example of socialism. They kind of are. It depends a bit how they operate. And, is it really socialism if it takes place in a capitalist society? No. Leftists debate that kind of topic, and that's fine. As you can see pretty clearly from these definitions, liberals are not socialists or leftists, as they really just want to reform the existing system rather than tear it down and start something else. But by these definitions, places that are usually called socialist, like the USSR, Mao's China, etc., are not. So to the claim that socialism killed tens of millions of people in the 20th century, I reply, you don't know what socialism is. And a lot of these right-wingers have debated socialists before, and so they can say, oh yeah, you always say that's not real socialism. How do you know your socialism would be any different? Because it decentralizes power, putting power into the hands of the people, not into the hands of owners, bureaucrats, and police. We're talking about completely different things. It's like saying, if I was buying a dog and you said to me, how can you be sure that that dog won't kill and eat you like a tiger? I'd say, because it's not a tiger. It's a dog. Dogs don't do that. If socialism leads to the massive inequality and concentration of power we see under capitalism, it must not be socialism. In future videos, I'll talk all about socialism, communism, anarchism, what those things mean, what it means to be on the left, feminism, along with fascism and anti-fascism. Suffice it to say, there aren't many right-wingers who really know what those things are. On the one hand, their lack of any understanding of what's meant by these terms, at least to people who identify with them, it's a kind of an advantage to the left. Most of the time when they talk about the left, they mean the Democratic Party. So they don't even know what they hate or why. We don't have to use the word socialism, for example. Just promote the idea of worker ownership of the means of production. You don't have to say you're left-wing, but that you really value freedom and justice. If you think that's dishonest, bear in mind they go around spreading distorted definitions of the words. And you almost definitely do not fit with their definitions of the words that you would have used. After all, if you say you're one of those bad words white America hates so much, they'll dismiss you out of hand. What? You're a socialist? You're a traitor to my country. Don't you know socialism killed 100 million billion people in 1926 alone? So now it's not me dismissing that, but they've already dismissed me. Right-wingers tend to suffer from a serious lack of curiosity. Look up the Dunning-Kruger effect, and you'll see how our confidence in our knowledge of something has nothing to do with how well we know that subject, and that the people with the most superficial understanding of something are often the most certain of themselves. And so people can read an article or even a book and think they understand a subject, which might lead them down a path toward other people who also don't understand, and maybe even worse, people who cynically manipulate them and lead them further down the path toward certainty, but away from truth. This lack of curiosity is foreign to me. I read a lot, and when I see a new word, I look it up. When I hear people online talking about terms that I'm not familiar with in contexts I am familiar with, I look up those terms. I might even read whole books on the subject. And if the subject is interesting or important, I'll probably read widely on the subject. You can read one book, but if you haven't read anything else on the subject, the book's flaws. It's hard to who but incurious people would rather have the very limited perspective they've always had and just be sure of themselves. As they often use wrong definitions, they often hear words and jump to conclusions, and so they get angry at the wrong things. Look at the people who write whole articles about how masculinity isn't actually toxic, the whole while not realizing the term toxic masculinity does not refer to all masculinity. They could have looked it up. Do they know about Google? No, they chose not to look it up, but to jump to conclusions and waste however long it took them to write those articles. Or look at the conservative guy who saw something once. I don't even remember what I was saying, but he saw what I said, and he told me that I've been brainwashed by Marxist professors to hate America. And I was like, What the hell are you talking about? I never had a Marxist professor. And I'm not a Marxist now, and I wasn't when I was in university anyway. So what the hell are you talking about is a perfectly good response to that. These right-wingers have strong opinions on topics that they don't know anything about, and they're not interested in hearing you tell them the truth about it. So why would I waste my time trying to reason with them? If they're committed to their lies and their prejudices, fuck them. The things they care about are not problems. Almost everything they talk about is either not a problem or a really small part of the real problem. For example, they've got this thing about the law. Breaking the law is sin to these people. So if you've broken the law, it's just fine. If you break the law, the police can just do whatever they like to you. Anything. That's fine. Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for freedom. Let me ask you something. Do you folks think that the law is like a set of objective truths that a society has discovered and accumulated over time? Because that's pure delusion. Laws are written by corporate lobbyists mostly nowadays, or else by the staffers of politicians owned by lobbyists, and then they're forced on all the rest of us. That's freedom? You think they make laws for our benefit? Here's the thing about the law. Nobody actually believes in the law. I know it might sound weird, but nobody believes in the law. I'll prove it to you right in front of your eyes. Every day I see people speeding, turning right on stop signs where it's illegal, not coming to full stops behind the white line, jaywalking. I see people using each other's Wi-Fi connections and using fake names online. Those are illegal. Drinking while they're underage, drinking in public, smoking where they're not allowed to smoke, smoking weed, or whatever other illegal drug, marching or protesting without a permit, gambling, cutting hair without a permit or a license. Oh dear. And of course, worst of all, selling things at garage sales and lemonade stands without a license and without reporting it on their taxes. The criminals, lock them up. All those things are illegal, and yet we do them all the time. The only time people say they care about the law is when they can use it as an excuse to use violence against someone. And that's why they're always talking about illegal immigration. It's the law, right? Just fill out years and years of paperwork, go through lots of interviews, pay thousands of dollars in fees, and then maybe we'll let you in legally. Shit, son, these people want to work now, not after years of expensive, pointless procedures. They broke the law, so it's just fine to throw them into cages or kick them out of this enormous landmass you call your country. What other problems do they care about? They talk a lot about terrorism too, and they get that all wrong. They focus entirely on Muslims when it comes to terrorism, and they would never call, say, the recent shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, terrorism, because it wasn't a Muslim who did it. Their attitude towards Muslims is basically, I don't know them, I don't want to know them. Again, an incuriosity that makes it impossible for them to understand this subject. If you ask them about causes, they basically just reprise George W. Bush after 9/11. They hate us for who we are, because we're Christians and because we love freedom and democracy and shit like that. And that's how gullible they really are. Or, well, at least that's what they say. Maybe they're just saying it to justify prejudice. I don't know. Either way, I'm not impressed. But the terrorists don't say any of that. None of them have ever said that. They point to the long history of imperialism, the innumerable injustices committed by the U.S. government, whether directly in the many wars that it can't stop waging, or indirectly by supporting the governments of Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. I'd be pretty pissed too if someone had blown up my family or my friend's family. But no, I guess they're just mindless terrorists who hate us for who we are. That was a masterstroke in political rhetoric, I think. It made millions of Americans think naturally. The only recourse was to declare war on those people. If they hate us for our endless wars, well, we could just stop going endlessly to war, couldn't we? But if they hate us for who we are, well, we can't change our values and our religion and so on. So I guess we better kill them. Brilliant. Pure lies. Whatever they believe deep down, these right-wingers keep spreading these lies. These are the people at the wheel of the post-9/11 Islamophobia bus. That has led to harassment, lynching, mass shootings, a highly restrictive immigration policy, and a mandate for war all over the world. I don't respect people who stoke fears for their own fame and power, so why would I debate them as if I did? They want to criminalize all abortions, because nothing says pro-life than inducing young women to get back alley abortions because they can't afford to pay for what's nothing more than a mistake. And in many cases, it wasn't a mistake. What if they've been violated and they still can't have abortions? What the fuck? A lot of critics of pro-lifers have pointed out that they just want to control women, and I have trouble disagreeing. That's your body? No, that's our body, and we will tell you what you're allowed to do with it. And I might maybe take more seriously their concern for a bunch of cells we call a fetus if they didn't show such disdain for all other people's lives, encouraging war and looking the other way on police violence, applauding Trump's policy of separating families. Pro-life? Pro-family? What a bunch of hypocrites. They hate LGBTQ people. They won't use the word hate, of course, but like everything else they believe, you can figure it out from looking at their actions. They don't know a goddamn thing about biology, but they'll say being anything other than a heterosexual binary male or female is unnatural. Yeah, thanks, Grandma. Great to hear your worthless opinion. They'll say transgender people have to use the bathroom of the sex they were assigned at birth, or they're not allowed in any bathrooms, or whatever the hell it is. Either way, it's not about bathrooms at all. Just like separate water fountains wasn't about water fountains. In fact, I'd like to quote Laverne Cox on this subject just to get more perspective. Quote, "Bathroom bills are not really about bathrooms. They're about whether trans people have the right to exist in public spaces. If we can't use public bathrooms, we can't go to school, we can't work, we can't go to healthcare facilities. It's really about the right to exist in public spaces. I have the right to exist in public spaces." End quote. And they even love passing laws and saying that public facilities or anywhere can just refuse care to someone if they're LGBT. It's easy to make an argument from freedom in favor of this kind of shit. They should have the freedom to be allowed to deny people services or even medical treatment. Because, like freedom and shit. Again, what they really want is to keep people they don't like out of public space. Racial segregation isn't cool anymore, so, let's segregate on a different basis. Fuck that. Modern right-wingers seem to have relaxed their hatred of gay men, though, maybe temporarily, I don't know. So maybe in a generation or two they won't hate trans people as much as they do now. Maybe the rate of bullying, murder, and suicide among trans and non-binary people will have gone down. For now, transphobia is a huge problem, but the existence of trans people is not. The other stuff they talk about, like even less of a problem. They make long videos about what a tragedy it is that there's a smaller proportion of white males in superhero movies now, to contrast with the 100% white males that they were presumably hoping for. They get incensed whenever someone refuses to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem or whatever other pointless civic customs they can use to beat people into conformity. They rail against political correctness, which to me, I'm pretty sure, as far as I can tell, political correctness really just means being careful in your thinking and your language, not to unnecessarily hurt people who are already vulnerable to bullying and violence. I think when they say political correctness is killing this country, they just mean I want to be allowed to make fun of and bully blacks, Muslims, trans people, whoever I want, with whatever consequences for those people, with impunity. Now that they're actually getting called out on their bullshit, they blame political correctness and say things like, oh, you just call everyone you disagree with a racist. Well, if you're getting called a racist all the time, maybe you should look at, your own behavior before getting self-righteous. Along the same lines, they talk about safe spaces. It's the same as their attitude towards socialism. They don't know what safe spaces are, they just know they're bad. A safe space is a chance for people to talk without getting interrupted or shut down. It's a space where people who are usually discriminated against and harassed and intimidated out of public spaces can feel safe from harm. Let's say a group of women of color organized a safe space for themselves at a university. That makes sense, because women of color have different problems than white women or men of color, definitely different problems from me. And they do get harassed and intimidated and shut up. If I, a white male, am not allowed into their space, I won't get angry. It's none of my business. Maybe the whole school is to be considered a safe space. That's okay too. It means people like, again, women of color, non-binary people maybe, should be free to talk and not have to face violence of any kind. It's ironic to hear these freedom of speech people on the right decrying safe spaces when for some people, a safe space is the only time they can actually express themselves in public without fear. What could be more important to freedom of speech than to ensure that the most marginalized people get to express themselves? So okay, let's recap the things these righties think are problems. Okay, let's see if I got it. First, breaking the law when someone else does it, right? People moving across lines on the map without the correct documentation. The effects of a shitty foreign policy, but not the policy itself. They've never been told that that's bad. The removal of unwanted cells from a woman's body. People who are a different gender from the one that they were assigned at birth. People who don't conform to pointless civic customs. People calling them out on their shitty behavior. And people exercising their freedom of speech. There are literally concentration camps funded by your tax dollars with children in them who report sexual assault by the guards. And these right-wingers want to talk about where trans people are allowed to go to the bathroom. Shit, they encourage these camps, saying things like, oh, we should have followed the law, and we need strong borders, as if strong borders wasn't a euphemism for ethnic cleansing. Here are some real problems. Real, actual things that are real problems. About imperial war. That kills exponentially more people than non-state terrorism, meanwhile making the powerful more powerful and the rich richer and the poor poorer. Not a problem though? Okay, fine. Go ahead, keep encouraging them. What about poverty? It's preventable. But it's responsible for millions of deaths around the world every year, including in the US, Canada, the UK, France, Australia, wherever else that could easily afford to take care of everybody. What about even deeper? We could go even deeper. What about social hierarchy? A few people hold an enormous amount of power over the rest of us, and most people never even question it. What about authoritarianism and oppression anywhere? Meaning destroying freedom and justice with real violence of all kinds against innocent people. Again, unnecessary, undesirable for all but the privileged few, but still seen as just the way things are. And on that note, another problem, the lack of critical thinking in society. I'll get to that again in other videos for sure, but for now, you can see the lack of critical thinking in how people become or stay right-wing in the first place. They learn things that aren't true, like all terrorists are Muslims, or they hate us for our freedoms, or we had to invade Iraq because of 9/11 and terrorism. And that guides their thinking thereafter. They share memes that say things like there are Muslim no-go zones in European cities, or towns somewhere or other forced to take down Christmas decorations because it offends Muslims, without realizing the whole thing was a lie. They could just have Googled it and skimmed through a couple of articles, but instead they read these sites like Breitbart that twist things or just make shit up. I see the lack of critical thinking when people tell me the books that they've read that make them think they understand Muslims, and then they go quoting lying opportunist assholes like Pamela Geller and G. Gabrielle and Sam Harris. But whatever you do, don't ever call them bigots. I mean, sure, they focus on and scapegoat only one huge group of people and excuse all the same or worse behavior in their own group. No, don't call them bigots, because of course they're not bigots, even though, nowadays, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, but it says it's not a duck, well, it must not be one. Oh, and by the way, all these real problems, war, hierarchy, oppression, lack of critical thinking, they're linked. I'll be talking about them a lot. Let's get back to why I don't debate right-wingers. They want to debate things as an excuse to shit on people, which currently means especially Muslims and trans people. They use black and brown people as tokens in their organizations to hide the racism that infuses their thinking. And they probably don't even recognize their racist tendencies because they don't really get racism. They don't know it's systemic, deep in the culture in places like, well, all of the Americas, Europe, and even elsewhere too. The point is, it's not as simple as he's a racist, but I'm not a racist. Same is true of sexism, by the way. It's about cultural tendencies, not separating people into good and bad. It's that racism, namely white supremacy, is so deeply embedded in these places that if we actually care about it, we should be trying to unlearn all the bullshit about race that we've learned. From stereotypes to beauty standards, to just learning to shut up and pass the mic to people of color instead of telling them to shut up. What's that? Conservatives don't tell people of color to shut up? Well, what do you think all lives matter means? That was white people's way of erasing black people and shutting them up for the crime of suggesting that they shouldn't be indiscriminately gunned down by police. Well, what would you do if a little girl came up to you and said, "I'm really hungry, could you give me some food?" And you shoved your hand in their face and said, "Hey, kid, lots of people are hungry. I don't have to listen to you." I mean, they're saying, please respect us as human beings. And then they go, but what about black on black crime? Well, no. What about respecting them as human beings? It's like they have to change the subject so they never have to say that black lives actually matter. Not all of them literally hate black people, sure, but they stereotype them. They want more prisons and stricter laws, and they always talk about crime, and these things have always targeted people of color. They applaud the police that kill people of color, and they never listen to them, and they don't try to understand them. It's not even that hard for them to be racist nowadays while avoiding all accusations that they are. Sure, I don't literally hate black people, but I hate seeing them stand up for their rights. I hate Colin Kaepernick, and I made a 20-minute YouTube video about how Black Panther is left wing ideological SJW bullshit with an agenda. And I talk about how black folks demanding their rights they're not protesting the proper way. This is the right way. And then we'll only listen to you if you protest the right way. Yeah, I'm sure you'll listen to them then. And they call the cops on black folks when they gather in public. They always give killer cops the benefit of the doubt, and they grasp at whatever straws they possibly can to show the victim deserved to die. What, he said something rude to the police officer? What, he once smoked weed for a while? He robbed a store 10 years ago? Oh, well, he was obviously a piece of shit who deserved what he got. But then I guess when you can advocate for a war on Iraq in which 1 million people are likely to die, and of course 1 million people did die, just because you're afraid of brown people and you can still sleep soundly at night, you're just a scared, confused mess of a person. They have this assumption, it's just an assumption nowadays, that everybody has equal rights. They're equal in the eyes of the law because, the law doesn't literally say that there should be segregation. It just might happen to be the effect of the law. And everyone's colorblind. Everyone claims to be colorblind. I'm so colorblind I don't see race. I couldn't possibly be a racist. I know black people. So there is no more racism. Or it's confined to the margins, as if it were inevitable and free of causes and harmless, as long as it's over there. So things are fine now, right? Okay, so let's compare now and then, back in the 1950s, when black people started the civil rights movement. What were they mad about back then? Well, they were poorer and had worse health care than whites. They were confined to the poorer parts of town, and the cops were always called when they dared to gather in public. It was harder for them to get jobs than whites. It was harder for them to get loans than whites. They were far more likely to have their kids taken away by the state than whites. They were far more likely to go to prison than whites, and for longer and at younger ages. They were commonly harassed and arrested and killed by the police, especially when they had the gall to protest, just like in a police state. And at least half of white America cheered the police on. Black churches got burned, and blacks were lynched by white civilians acting out their fantasies of ethnic cleansing. All of that still happens today. I mean, it's the same as how they can't bear to admit that as white people in North America, they might just have privileges that non-white people have. The fact that they only talk about so-called racism against white people is a sign, I think, of that privilege. One of several privileges they and I have as white people are they can put their fingers in their ears regarding the daily violence against people in communities of color. They don't even hear when black people get shot by the police, or when mosques are vandalized or black churches burned. Happens all the time. But they will tell you about this time they saw a video of a bunch of scary black people saying, "Fuck white people," or something like that. And that's all they need to know about racism in America. In fact, I once talked to this guy named Brian Kolfage. I think that's how you pronounce it. You can look him up if you want. Kolfage. He recently started a GoFundMe for the border wall. And anyway, he does or used to run this Facebook page called Freedom something. I don't remember what, because, Americans love the word freedom. So everything has freedom and patriotism and other words in it. And I asked him, what exactly do you do to promote freedom? Because, looking at his posts, he was mostly just supporting wars and borders and shitting on Muslims. And this might sound weird to a conservative, but closing borders shows disdain for freedom, not a love for it. Anyway, I asked him how he and his page actually promote freedom. He totally ignores my question, because apparently it was too hard for him to come up with one example. And instead went to my profile and saw that among my heroes was Huey Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panthers, and he's like, I can't explain freedom to somebody who likes the Black Panthers. The Panthers were the black equivalent of the KKK. Yes, he said that. And so anyway, I said to him, so you can't answer my question, okay. What history have you read that makes you think that the Panthers were as bad as the KKK? And then he blocked me. Pathetic. They really police the tone of angry people whenever they can, as if we don't have reasons to be angry, by saying things like, can't you have a calm, rational debate about this? See, this is why leftists blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, motherfucker, we just hate the hateful bullshit that you're saying and the very real consequences that it has. But in a debate, apparently, if you get angry because someone is dehumanizing you or your friends, you lose. I mean, I'd be pretty fucking pissed if somebody was citing unscientific studies to give their bullshit the veneer of truth and science for the purpose of dehumanizing people. They love doing that. They create and work for think tanks and publishing houses that make shit up about the people they hate and then cite their publications as evidence. Everybody uses the language of science nowadays, but a lot of those people spit in the face of actual data. Debate is just not a good place for the exchange of ideas, because that's not what it is. It's not an exchange of ideas. Like they could easily, I could be talking and they'll pick at some minor point and go, see, because he said this, leftists hate freedom of speech or something. Or they're hypocrites or whatever. And that is what like half of the audience will remember. In fact, these folks will bring up freedom of speech every chance they get. They sometimes even name events that really only exist to shit on marginalized people. They call them like, Free Speech Convention 2019 or whatever nice sounding words you would see through pretty easily if you actually listen to them. They'll say deplatforming someone means you hate freedom of speech. Well, what if you just hate racism? Right-wingers are always talking about freedom, but it's clear from their actions they're actually quite hostile to freedom. I mean, they want to control women's bodies by restricting abortion. They want to control everybody's bodies by criminalizing drugs. Love of the police and the law, up to the point of selling killer cops donations, as if as if to say, here you go, thanks so much for killing that black guy. Their deference to authority, their desire for strict and ever stricter borders, the way they brush off the surveillance state with, well, I have nothing to hide. So you don't need privacy? Their applause for their fellows on the right who've suggested lynching journalists and shooting asylum seekers at the southern border from helicopters, all of which, by the way, is quite illegal under international law, but like everyone else, they only care about those laws they want to impose on others, not the ones that restrict their own behavior. They're just fine with seeing peaceful protesters get their asses kicked by the police, and they spread memes showing cars driving into groups of protesters, fuck your protest or something. And since that has actually happened, we can be pretty sure this right-wing internet shit is quite influential offline. You've got the fact that they attack everybody who doesn't conform to their ideas of what their country should be like. Their claim to dislike taxes and big government, but their unswerving support for people who raise taxes and enlarge the state. And they never saw a war they didn't like. Yeah, I don't like big government, but I do want the federal government to override the states, and thus the 10th Amendment, on abortion and drugs and sanctuary cities and whatever other victimless actions they want to criminalize. Yeah, Obama abused executive power, while Trump declared a national emergency to unconstitutionally use the military and unconstitutionally appropriate funds for a border wall for a non-existent crisis. Just like they say they mistrust the elite, but continually suck up to billionaires. I don't know why they don't like Hillary Clinton. They have so much in common. I'll tell you something about freedom. Here's the thing about freedom. Freedom leads to diversity of one kind or another. You can have freedom, or you can have conformity. You can't have both. They want to debate because they want these platforms so they can openly hate on brown people and Muslims and trans people and illegal immigrants and whoever else is the scapegoat of the day, which is what they do all the time if you listen to them. And they pretend that their words don't have any consequences. It's like that guy who went to every one of your little freedom meetings who stabbed those black people or shot those Muslims. They weren't influenced by you? Look at how Ben Shapiro tweeted right after that massacre in Christchurch. You shouldn't share or even read the Christchurch Killers Manifesto. You know why he said that? Because the guy cited Ben and other people like him as one of his influences. See, their words make a few people commit acts of violence and make a lot of other people turn their heads when it happens. Well, they were Muslims. They probably deserved it. The guy was a criminal. It's fucking disgusting, and they should be fucking ashamed of themselves. Why would I even want to talk to people like that? I think maybe one reason they hate illegal immigration, aside from the unconscious cultural biases against brown people, is they have this zero-sum mentality. Zero-sum thinking is thinking that if you have more, I must have less. Because whatever resources we're talking about, they're limited. This kind of thinking can bring out nationalism and racism, which are almost the same thing, by the way. Because if there are people who somehow don't deserve our resources, then they shouldn't be allowed in our country, or even maybe should be killed. Zero-sum thinking is at the heart of eco-fascism, which I had never heard of until that piece of shit killed those Muslims in Christchurch. Eco-fascism apparently holds that there are limited resources, and since the environment is getting worse, we should kill off all the bad people. That's logical, right? As if that's a solution to environmental problems. But even those who are not eco-fascists still can't seem to shake zero-sum thinking about so many things. I mean, I wonder if that's where, if their opposition to feminism is a good example of this. Traditionally in the US and the rest of the Anglophone dominated and settled world, the norm for families and households has been nuclear family dominated by the breadwinning man. They seem to think that feminism would mean that the family was dominated by a woman instead of a man. Couldn't you just share? Couldn't things be like, instead of one of the people has all the decision-making power and the power to inflict violence, Maybe more than one person in the family? No, not possible. Yeah, okay. That's zero-sum thinking. If you're a man and that's how you think, then it makes sense that feminism would not be in your interest. But that's not what feminism is. Feminism seeks to end sexism. It aims to end sexual exploitation and oppression, whoever starts it and whomever is the target. It's about equality of people regardless of gender. And yet I've actually heard people tell me shit like feminism is bad, or their preferred phrase, feminism is cancer. And by the way, you can always tell when somebody doesn't know what they're talking about or they're full of shit because they're using the exact same words that everybody else uses on this topic. Anyway, I've actually heard them say they don't need feminism because men and women should be equal. Which is feminism. What they're really saying is that they're so intellectually lazy, they only have enough time to take someone else's opinion and not enough effort to find out what words mean for themselves. They don't even understand the things or people they hate. How can you debate with someone like that? I imagine I would spend a couple of minutes explaining feminism, and my interlocutor, committed to their existing beliefs, wouldn't listen. They can't listen. Because if they did, they might have to change their minds. They might have to admit that they didn't know what they were talking about. And I might be wrong. It might have nothing to do with zero-sum thinking, after all. If they don't know anything about the things they supposedly disagree with, then any liar could take over and steer their thinking. But it's not surprising that people nowadays, especially Americans, would think in zero-sum terms, because so much of their lives is structured that way. Elections are winner-take-all. Wealth and power are concentrated. All of our games and sports are based on competition and winning. And nobody believes more blindly in the non-existent benefits of competition than right-wing Americans. We'll probably talk about competition some other time, if you like, but for now, so you know, competition has zero psychological benefit to us and is usually pretty damaging. I know it sounds weird. I used to think it was good too. Nearly all research on the subject says it isn't. But because it's American, it must be right. They're always punching down. You know, punching down? I only learned that term recently, so I'll explain. If you're talking, joking, developing an opinion, does it come at the expense of people who are more vulnerable to discrimination and violence than you? That's called punching down. When right-wingers shit on the most marginalized people in society, like racial minorities or LGBTQ people, they're punching down. Punching the people who already have it worse. You could punch up, attacking the ruling class for its innumerable and ongoing crimes. The closest they ever get to that is to say how much they hate, George Soros and Hillary Clinton. And I don't like those people either, but it's for really different reasons. You could also punch sideways, which is, I think, what I'm doing now, by explaining why people of roughly equal place in the social hierarchy as me are wrong. But why do they have to punch down? It's just bullying. It's such bullshit. I mean, it's the same as the way they have every possible excuse ready on hand every time the police kill a black guy or someone with mental health problems and they're forced to hear about it. Every possible excuse. The cops feared for their lives. They thought the suspect had a gun. They mistook them for someone else. The police, they do good nearly all the time. Look at this PR photo from the local police department. Or, if he didn't want to get killed, he shouldn't have mouthed off like that because, saying something rude to a cop is a good reason for them to murder you. Or if you don't like the police, call a crackhead. By the way, that's pretty much the limit of conservative humor. They either believe the police are so blind that they could mistake just about anything for a gun, And so cowardly, they'll shoot anyone for any reason, and that all of that's okay, or they're covering the white supremacist state. And when black people demand their rights, right-wingers, not all of whom are white, incredibly, will say shit like, slavery was a long time ago. Get over it. Or other people have been enslaved over history too, Not listening to people explain that the legacies of slavery, which have filled several volumes, are still with us, as incidentally are the legacies of native genocide. These right-wingers simply can't admit any of this. You could explain to them the definition of racism and connect it to their behavior. You could show the clear connection between their words and the violence of their followers. They won't admit any of it. Admitting the truth would mean throwing out their entire worldview. They also love talking about how awesome capitalism is when they barely understand that at all either. Their mistaken belief that capitalism or Americaism or whatever it is they think is a system where anyone can get rich helps fuel the idea that the poor are poor by choice. So it's just fine to turn your head when the police kick their asses or they die of exposure. It's nonsense. The system does not allow everyone to get rich. It doesn't work that way. It allows a few people to get rich off the backs of other people and grants them an enormous amount of power. So much so that the idea of calling places like the US and Canada democracies cheapens the whole idea to worthlessness. I mean, who really wants democracy when the entire process is owned by the rich? Capitalism creates poverty and violence through its endless plunder of all except the ruling class. But these right-wingers think Economics 100A or a Milton Friedman book was enough for them to confidently claim the rich are not the reason that you're poor. And because so much of what they say indirectly promotes violence against vulnerable people, we can see here the limits of the modern debate format. Let someone talk, no matter what they're saying, and then address what they said. Well, what I want to say can't be conveyed in a few seconds or even in a few minutes. For example, if someone started talking about why the Muslims are bad, how exactly would I address that? How could I take someone through my knowledge of this subject in a minute or two when it's taken me years of reading and experience? Never mind they would have to read at least a dozen books on this subject, but they would have needed years of experience meeting and being friends with Muslims to really get it. Or would I go through each of their points, which could leave their whole message about the Muslims are bad, could leave that whole message intact? Or what if they start explaining why transgender people are all mentally ill and or whatever bullshit, or don't exist? I don't know what their argument is nowadays. I can talk a bit about the subject and I can assert that trans women are women, for example, but I'm not a genetic biologist. So I can't explain the ins and outs of exactly how this works. I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't know exactly how people who don't fit the male-female binary have existed in different times and places, at least not as well as some people do. Your opponent in a debate will pounce on something like that. They'll pounce on something like, well, I've read about it, but I don't remember all the details, when that's pretty much my whole body of knowledge. Likewise, I could point out there's no agree to disagree option when facts are concerned, and that their beliefs don't fit the facts. But of course, that would just be a chance for them to say, I want to shut them up, or I don't listen, or I can't take a dissenting opinion, when again, it's not a matter of opinion. Fortunately, I don't have to know all the biology, psychology, and anthropology that would explain being transgender or non-binary. All I need to do is treat them like people, give them respect, which includes using their pronouns, help them out when they need help, and otherwise leave them the fuck alone. Is that so hard? It's the same when they talk about the Crusades. I'm not an expert on the Crusades, but I know a lot more than these right-wingers who say it was just Muslim aggression against Christian land or something like that, because my knowledge comes from books, not from me. You don't have to know more than the basics of what you're talking about to realize these people are full of shit. And that's one reason why it's infuriating when they insist on playing the victim. Go, they won't let me say this. The left wants to shut us down. I'm being persecuted. They say to huge crowds on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and packed auditoriums of people paying to see them. They're so enamored of their own voices and their persecution complex that they actually call themselves the intellectual dark web. Pat yourself on the back a little harder. You can explain why every one of their points is wrong, and yet some people watching these light debates will gravitate towards their ideas regardless. So why give them a platform in the first place? I'd like to quote at length from an article from theoutline.com by someone named Ashley McCree. She's talking about when she was 16. Quote, a classmate decided to start up the debate club again, and I pounced on the opportunity to join. Our first subject was reinstating the death penalty, and I was anti. Since we were young and sincere, we all picked the sides we really believed in. One of the people on the pro side is now a cop. For our opening speech, I gave all the points you would expect in an argument against the death penalty. The unacceptably high rate of false convictions, the particular targeting of non-white defendants, the cost, the cruelty, the lack of data proving its effectiveness as a deterrent. My opponent's speech was much shorter. He simply named 3 famous child killers, including one who had murdered someone 3 miles from our school, and said, "Do you think these people deserve to live?" My opponent won. Then skip a bit. But any form of debate is inherently flawed. The aim of debate is not to provide a detailed, cogent, well-sourced answer to the question at hand. The aim of the debate is to be the most convincing, not the smartest. Anyone who's good at debating knows this. This is how former Breitbart scribe Ben Shapiro has a reputation as an intellectual warrior, when his arguments mostly consist of saying incorrect things very fast. This is why conservative political commentator Steven Crowder has a series called Change My Mind, in which he ambushes random college kids with a big binder full of pre-prepared talking points and pulls the mic away from them anytime they seem like they might actually change someone's mind. This is how a call to murder pedophiles got my high school audience on side better than my scribbled stats on deterrence rates did. People, yes, even you, do not make decisions on an entirely rational basis. An audience is more easily won over with a one-liner that inspires applause or laughter than a 5-minute explanation of a complicated phenomenon. A false statistic repeated confidently will be more convincing than a truth stated haltingly by some guy you've never heard of and who you've already decided you don't like because he's against the guy you came to see. Massively complex ideologies with hundreds of years of scholarship behind them are reduced to a couple of fast-talking egos and dockers thinking about the best way to make their opponent look like a dumbass. Debate is not politics, it's theater. End quote. Certainly how I feel, anyway. Then you've got history. The knowledge of history, these right-wingers, it's just about non-existent. In some cases, totally delusional. You can tell by their memes and articles and whatever else they post. They talk as if the native genocide was accidental, because we only have the best of intentions. Or slavery wasn't actually that bad, or not as bad as in other places, or whatever, because we had such good intention. Or the wars on Vietnam or Iraq or any of the other wars, those were about freeing those people, because we only had the best of intention. Or the civil rights movement ended most racism, and now black people are equal, so anyone still protesting must be wrong. They have no idea why millions of people from Latin America might not just want to go to the US, but be owed a place to live in the US. Since US-backed, US-funded, US-approved dictators destroyed their homes and villages and destroyed the economy to take even more wealth away from the people on the bottom. Shit, conservatives who were alive during 9/11 and the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan, some of them still think those wars were justified. They'll tell themselves anything. And they really believe the schools, academia, the media are leftist. Not even close to leftist. CNN made an unfavorable report on Trump, so it must be leftist. Professors don't tell you to blindly worship everything right-wingers love about America, so they're leftists. It's ridiculous. There are no leftist mainstream media at all. None of them even remotely come close to what actual leftists would consider leftist thought. Why would they? They're huge corporations owned by the rich. Rich don't want socialism. They would lose everything. Academia, meanwhile, has mostly been in the pocket of the elite for decades, and probably since the first universities, though I don't really know. They do plenty of research, sometimes unpaid, that corporations take and patent for free. They buy off heads of departments, like political science, where I studied, so that it's harder for leftist professors to get in. And besides, there are right-wing organizations who will campaign to have leftist professors removed. And they work. What? You criticized Israel? You don't love capitalism? That professor is brainwashing our children. Right, because they weren't brainwashed before. So they make up problems where they don't exist, and they play down real problems. You probably saw recently how Candace Owens from Turning Point USA said white supremacy and white nationalism might have meant something in the past, but now they're just electoral slogans for the Democratic Party. Did she just not know? Did she hear but ignore and forget? I mean, basically what she's saying, whether honestly or not, is that because the media she follows don't report much of the quite regular and common discrimination, arrest, beating, and murder of people of color in the US, it probably isn't really happening. Or it's not so bad that we should do anything. Well, when they gain more power, it might be too late for you to change your mind. But for now, great, whatever. Keep pretending it doesn't exist, or it's not a problem, or it's just a tiny minority. When the number of white supremacist and overtly neo-Nazi groups is rising in the US, Canada, and Europe, and Australia, and the number of people they're killing is rising too. You can't just sweep your history and your present under the rug just because it's unpleasant. It'll come back to haunt you, or someone else, whether you understand why or not. But now I've used the conservative N-word, Nazi. That will give right-wingers a chance to trot out their next cliche. You call everyone who disagrees with you a Nazi or a fascist or whatever. Okay. I expect there are lots of people who consider themselves leftists who do, actually. I don't know anyone like that, though, and I don't speak for them. I can only speak for myself. Thoughtful people, they don't call everyone a fascist, but they do call out racism and bullying and lying and other traits of fascism when they hear it. If people are calling you a fascist or a racist and you don't like it, try examining your own behavior for a change. There are people literally trying to spark a race war, and your words are helping them justify it. You have nothing to say about that? No, you just distance yourselves from it. Nothing to do with me. I never said we should kill those people. I'm only talking. Therefore, I bear no responsibility for the people I create. Yeah. That's what they'll say. That's great. Whatever. Yeah. They're so afraid of knowledge. Maybe this is the more rank and file conservatives type, but they're so afraid of knowledge they'll say fake news. They won't even make a whole sentence. They'll just go fake news. whenever they don't want to believe something. And then they go and watch Fox. Or they get their news from websites with patriot in their names and defending America in their tagline. I bet you I could start a news site called The Last Line of Defense and put out all kinds of fake nonsense and get millions of Americans to share what I post. Oh, wait, that's already happened. And by the way, plenty of people on the left disagree with me, and they do debate, or at least offer to debate, these right-wingers. I suggest an article by Nathan J. Robinson of Current Affairs. I'll let you look it up. It's called Why Won't the Right Debate Us? They're angry, they're full of spite and hate because they're scared. And they're scared because they're ignorant, but they're not self-aware enough to know that. You'll probably hear me use the word ignorant a lot, especially when describing these right-wing blowhards. It's not a crime to be ignorant. We're all ignorant. But it is irresponsible and dangerous to spread your ignorance around. And these people do that full time. Look at me. I've hardly read a book on space before. What if I were to use my time here to talk all about, say, why Pluto is really a planet, and why those jerks at NASA are all wrong? I don't even have to know what their argument is. All I need to do is to talk to other equally ignorant people about why I'm right and speak very confidently. Then I go around telling everyone Pluto is a planet, I guess like Jerry in that episode of Rick and Morty, making thousands of dollars per event, not because I know astronomy, but because I'm good at speaking and debating. Then I go to some scientists and I insist they take me seriously and let me speak at their conferences. And I accuse them of lying about me in the articles they write about me and tell them if they don't let me speak, they hate freedom of speech. I'm being silenced, I could say. Those NASA people don't want me to say this. They're trying to censor me. They're trying to censor the truth. No, they just don't have time to listen to my bullshit. They shouldn't waste their time listening to my bullshit. Oh, but because I've been told I'm entitled to my opinion, however wrong, I insist my opinion deserves a place next to everyone else's. It doesn't. What kind of ignorant, smug little know-it-all would I have to be to go around asserting that shit? Someone who says Pluto is a planet just doesn't get astronomy. Likewise, people who say trans people are all mentally ill is wrong. And saying so is a great way to dehumanize both trans people and the mentally ill, making them much more vulnerable to discrimination and murder than the average person. As far as I'm concerned, until you have an informed opinion, you have no place in the discussion. Sit down and you listen. And not everything is up for debate. Gaining knowledge takes hard work. It's not about reading a couple of articles and seeing memes all day that reinforce what you believe. It takes reading, applying, experience, and critical thinking at each stage. And you can't be afraid to unlearn things, too. Since you've been injected with so much bullshit over the years, when you begin unlearning things, your whole worldview will probably come crashing down. That's a good thing. Without knowledge, perspective, and critical thinking, you're vulnerable to the millions of opportunist liars who want to tell you how to think. They want to make you think in ways that are against your interest. After all, why hate brown people, poor people, and people with different ideas of what gender is? What have they ever done to you? People of all colors and genders should be linking arms to fight our oppressors, not letting ourselves be divided so we remain blind to our oppression. So if you're one of you're of the Ben Shapiro, Sargon of Akkad, Milo, no one even remembers his name anymore, persuasion, I probably have no interest in talking directly to you. I know what you think. It's not based on facts. I don't respect it. Having taken out the trash, I would like to invite some people to discuss these issues that I'm interested in. And I'd especially like to listen to people people of color, gender and sexual minorities, disabled people, really anybody who has a story to tell that's not just that of a white, heterosexual, cisgender, able-bodied